Hey YouTube, today I'm going to be doing a video tutorial on how to replace the center roller assembly on your third generation Honda Odysseys, covering years 2005 through 2010. And basically, what the center roller purpose is on the sliding door is that it is how the power door cable assembly attaches to the door to open and close the sliding doors. So the roller hinge that we're going to be replacing is this piece right here along the center rail assembly on my power sliding door. And the one I'm doing today is actually the passenger side, but the procedure is essentially the same for the driver side hinge. And how you can tell that the roller's worn out is that it squeaks really badly, like how mine is right now, as well as the fact that the power door assembly binds every so often when it's opening or closing the door. First, make sure that you disable the power door assembly by switching the master power switch to the off position. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove the rail cover assembly located along the body line here. And how we're going to gain access to the bolts is that there's one securing this cover behind this door and the other bolt is behind this taillight, which we'll need to remove. To remove the rear taillight assembly, we're going to use a small screwdriver here to undo the taillight retaining screw caps. And using a ratchet with an 8mm socket, undo the securing screws. Next, using both hands, pull the tail light out straight towards the rear of the vehicle. Undo the tail light connectors by giving them a twist to remove them. Once the tail light's been removed, go ahead and remove the 10mm bolt holding the center rail cover. Next, open up the sliding door to expose the retaining screw for this portion of the cover. Just slightly behind the sliding door on the inside edge of the center door rail, you'll see that there's a Phillips screw right here holding the rail cover in place. Undo it. And that's what it looks like removed, and that's the screw that we just took out. Now with the sliding door open, to actually undo or remove this cover off from the side of the van, we're actually going to carefully slide this cover forward like this to release this hidden center clip that you can't see, and then ever so carefully move this door as needed to carefully give us the maximum degree of clearance to remove this cover. Pay careful attention that you don't rub any sharp edges along your paint, as this little section here could potentially scratch your vehicle. This is what the rail assembly looks like once that cosmetic garnish cover has been removed. As you can see here, this is actually the power sliding door cable on this end, and then there's another cable on the opposing end on this side that essentially pull the door back and forth in this manner. Next, to prevent scratching of the body, what we want to do is that we want to liberally apply many layers of protective tape above and below where you're going to be working on the hinge, so you don't scratch or damage the body in any way. Now, I know I'm using duct tape here, and that might not necessarily be the best thing to be using, but I'm not going to be pressing it hard against the body, which would ultimately leave a residue. Now, because we're working with paint here, and I'm using a thick tape, I'm just going to apply a single layer of duct tape. But for those that are using like painter's tape, you might want to double up on the tape just to make sure that if your hinge should drop on your paint, that it's not going to puncture the tape and ultimately scratch your car. Apply the same to the top sections above the hinge. The next step here is to reopen the sliding door partway, and then using some paint or a felt tip marker to carefully mark and note the position of the old hinge relative to how it is mounted to this door. I'm just going to be using a Sharpie fine tip felt marker. I'm just going to mark this as best as I can so I know how to place my new hinge onto the same spot. Now it's worth mentioning here that on this hinge that contacts the sliding door, there's actually on the front facing section here 2 little half moon sort of circle cutouts. It's actually a really good idea to carefully mark where those half moons go, so that your repositioning of the new hinge is as precise as you can make it. Here's a slightly different angle view of these little half circles right here and right here, and I've used a felt tip marker to mark all of that. Once the door's been marked, go ahead and completely open up the sliding door to the full open position. With the door fully open and using a really thick rag, using a hydraulic jack, carefully support the bottom side of the sliding door at around the midpoint. The reason why we need to support this door is that we're going to be removing a support hinge from the vehicle temporarily while we replace the roller assembly. Now, as far as how high you need to jack it, this just needs to be able to contact the door. Don't actually continue jacking to raise the door, because that's not the purpose of why we're doing this. With the door fully open and supported with a hydraulic jack, use your 12mm ratchet or your wrench and undo the 2 hinge mount bolts that are on the sliding door here and here. Now, to release the hinge from the door rail, what we're going to do is that we're actually just going to tip the hinge up like this and then literally pull the roller out from underneath the rail assembly. You're allowed to pull the door on this van slightly out to give you a little more clearance if need be. This is why you need that hydraulic jack to support underneath the vehicle. Now here's the real tricky part. To release the rear cable, we're going to have to undo the cable from the cable holder assembly and then somehow finesse it in such a way that we can get the cable to come out. And I can show you better after I've taken this out how this is accomplished. And then to remove the front cable assembly, you can now pivot this hinge forward like this and then have it come out completely like that. While we're still in here, we can go ahead and take a clean towel and just sort of clean up the hinge area, paying careful attention not to wipe off any of your lines if you're not using any permanent ink. You can also clean the cable ends. So this is what I was making reference to earlier, is that this cable fits in a groove on the hinge in this manner, and it locks in and then twists out this way. So to remove it, we had to finesse this cable to come out and then slide it out like this. And it can be quite a tight fit, and I'll do a little more explaining when I take a close-up of all the hinge assemblies. Okay guys, so this is what the new part looks like here compared to the old part. So basically, the next step we're going to have to do is switch this door bracket assembly onto the new hinge. And this is why the sliding doors start acting up when this center roller goes haywire. As you can see here, these rollers are all flattened right out. I don't know how I can see that in the video actually, but they're all flattened out and there's some major metallic glazing on the face of the nylon rollers. And there's some really crazy play on this thing. There's supposed to be play, but this is an awful lot. And of course, this bearing here is also developing a little bit of play. And on the new roller, you can see that the rollers here have this rounded edge to them, and there's a little bit of wobble to them, but generally speaking it's a lot less than the old hinge. And of course the center bearing is nice and tight and super smooth. So let's go ahead and swap that hinge piece out. Clean up the top of the hinge here with a towel, exposing the little circlip here holding this pivot pin in place, and then using a small flat bladed screwdriver, insert it into the circlip and ever so carefully slide it out of its groove. Pay special attention when you're taking this out, because if you lose this, you're going to have to go to the dealership to buy a replacement. Next, using a hammer or a suitable whacking device, go ahead and just drive the pin through. To remove it, and then separating the two halves. Clean up the old pin, remove any grease and dirt and salt and road grime that's built up over the years. Clean up the bracket assembly. And then proceed to reassemble it onto the new hinge. Place your pin through. Use a suitable smacking device. Smack that back in so it's flush. Carefully reinstall your circlip onto the groove of the pin. Like so. Now, I mentioned earlier in my video, and you guys couldn't really see how those cables went into this hinge, and basically how it sat was like this. If you were to imagine that the sliding door rail was in here and this is the sliding door, and basically a cable assembly pulls this hinge this way to close it and this way to open it. So essentially this is like the toe hinge to open the door. But to take those cables out, it's a real tight fit and there's not really any slack. And so when I took this all apart, I had to remove the rear cable first, and you can sort of see, it's sort of like how a bicycle cable is held in, where you basically drop the cable in here, and then it kind of goes this way to pull it, and then conversely the front cable drops through this hole, and then pops out that way, and you have a cable basically going through like this to pull the door back and forth. But of course, to actually remove them, you have to turn them 90 degrees and then pop them out, which can be quite a nuisance. But basically that's how you guys can visualize how that needs to be reassembled. And then to reinstall this, we're going to essentially do the same thing but in reverse, installing the front cable first and then making sure everything's lined up and then reinstalling that rear cable assembly. So after about 15 minutes of screwing around with this cable and almost scratching my car, I managed to get this cable assembly back in. And one of the service tips I can give you guys is that, well, one, if you want, you can open up the rear window to give you some room to fish that cable through, or get a helper to hold that cable from falling out of your hands. And basically you're going to hook that front cable in to the front here, and then as close as you can to the back, basically in this position here, you're going to have to kind of finesse the cable in. You can actually tip this, but you're going to have to put that cable in, and then just use your fingers to force it to sort of wrap around that opening that you saw in the bracket when I had showed it earlier in the video. And yes, I'm going to say that was a pain in the ass to get that in, but basically it's all put back together now, and so now we're just going to tip the hinge assembly into the rail like this to get this slider to go back in. Now don't forget to put your cable through the cable guide, which is this here on the back side, and then just looking down the track to make sure that that front cable isn't binding at all. During this process, unfortunately, I had actually kind of nicked the Teflon or this nylon coating on the cable there, so let's hope that that doesn't cause this door to behave in a bad manner. Otherwise I'm going to have to disassemble the entire power drive assembly to replace a new cable. But I don't think that happened, so let's go ahead and tip this sliding door back in towards the van and then bolt it back together and reassemble everything. So everything is lined up nice and straight and perfectly to the marks I made on the door. So I'm going to go ahead and just hand tighten these with my ratchet, and then just double check again to make sure that everything is aligned properly. Lower the hydraulic jack. Now I don't recommend you guys using duct tape, to be quite honest with you. Just because it's quite sticky and it can rip paint off your car, but this is all I had today. To test the door, turn on the power for the main door switches. Test the door for functionality. Carefully reinstall the garnish trim. Loosely reinstall the rear Garnish 10mm bolt. Completely tighten the rail cover screw. Reinstall the inner trim Phillips screw. Reinstall the rear taillight assembly. Well, there you guys have it. A fairly straightforward fix that took me just over an hour and 15 minutes to put in a factory genuine Honda sliding door roller, and it went from a squeaky door that was binding and bucking when it was opening and closing to one that's super buttery smooth. Rate, comment, and subscribe.